All right, as we're passing some things out, we have some show and tell things that are going around. There's a Greek New Testament, there's a Hebrew Bible, and a big blue book that has the 4 Gospels line by line to see how you see the same thing in different Gospels, how it's lined up. So those are going around, so you just sort of look. Tonight we get to look at one of my favorite things to talk about, and unfortunately I can't talk too good about it. So can y'all hear in the back? Are y'all good? Okay. I might check a little bit. You might just do some reading tonight too, like this. As we approach the New Testament, the first hermeneutical task is to learn how to study the Gospels. 4 Gospels, what are their names? Matthew, okay, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When you look at it, the Gospels are the accounts written to portray the person and work of Jesus Christ. The 4 Gospels all tell the same story, but from different perspectives and to different audiences. If we all witness a car wreck out here on Woodruff Road, we're at different angles. We report different ways about the same event. You follow me? This is how the 4 Gospels are doing it. Reporting about the same event, different angles, different perspectives. Now, how are the Gospels composed? Let's look at some of this together as we go along on your sheet. The Gospels are books about Jesus, but not by Jesus. This makes them unique because they're books about him, but not by him. So they are somewhat biographical, but they're not written by Jesus. You can think about the pros and cons that go along with that, because obviously if you write a book about yourself, it's one thing, but if somebody else is writing about you, it's very, very different. The Gospels contain narrative portions as well as large portions of teaching, which makes it unique. He's talking about a story, and then all of a sudden he breaks into a sermon. Story, sermon. Lots of stories, a couple of sermons. So it's very unique how these things are put together. So they contain narrative portions as well as large portions of teaching. While parts are biographical, the Gospels never intended to record every detail of Jesus' life. How many of you would like to know what Jesus was like as a teenager? Anybody? We have no record of it, right? We know when he's 2. We know when he's born. We know a little bit about when he's 2. When you say, what was that story? Most likely the wise men came to him when he was 2 years old. If you look at how it's written, it says, Herod looked for every child 2 years old and younger, which means that they said we saw the star 2 years ago, which probably means when the wise men got to him, he's 2 years old. So the wise men actually don't belong on the nativity set, sorry. But they're there, so he's around 2. We see when he's about 12, a certain incident, and then after that, we only see him at age 30, right? And then nothing else. And is it because it's not important? It's obviously, I would imagine, Jesus at a 16-year-old would be great to know. Jesus at a 25-year-old would be great to know. But for the purpose of the story, it's not important. Not the way the gospel writers are saying. Because Jesus started his ministry at the time when Jewish boys turned rabbis at age 30. That's when they became men and started teaching. Now, how should we study the Gospels? Here's some things to note. Immerse yourself in the first century Judaism in which Jesus lived. So when you're reading a story and things don't make sense, you start identifying what is exactly going on in this Jewish culture. So in there's certain customs, there's certain beliefs, there's certain practices. And the more that you immerse yourself in it, the better, more acclimated you get to what's going on in that passage. So you understand some of those things. So you immerse yourself in the first century Judaism. Next, discover who Jesus' audience was in a given situation. So whenever he's speaking, whenever event's going on, you're trying to figure out who is the audience. Was it close disciples? Was it larger crowds? Or was it religious opponents? Let me ask this, and somebody can help explain this by just show of hand. Who was Jesus normally the nicest to? Anybody? Sinners, right? Children. Who was he the roughest on? Pharisees, religious people, right? So a lot of times you look at the context, who is he speaking to? Who are those people that he's speaking to in those moments? And to be able to look at and say, who is the audience in that moment? Because sometimes he seems a little bit harsher because it's religious people who ought to know better. Sometimes it seems like it's very easy because these are people who wouldn't know better. And so his way that he speaks, the way that he's acting, you always look to see who is his audience. Next, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the synoptic gospels. That synoptic means they describe events from similar point of view. If you have ever read Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, you go, I'm kind of reading the same thing sometimes. That's what that blue book that you got there is. There's some passages that literally are almost word for word verbatim. So why do we have three of them, right? What is the point of it? I'm glad you asked. We'll get into that in just a little bit. But there are a lot of similarities. And so they're synoptic. They're very similar. Why is John not included in that? Have you read John? It's very different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He just writes differently. He wrote about 20 to 30 years later after these have been written. And once those books had been around, they thought, you know what? We need to address the story a little different perspective. So think horizontally. Be aware of the parallels in other gospels. So when you read a story, you're always thinking, okay, well, Mark says it this way. Well, what about Matthew? What did Luke say about it? What does John have to say about this? So you're thinking horizontally, aware of what's going on in the other gospels, always aware of it. You'll notice some things that certain gospel authors, they're going to talk about, others will not. Also think, what? Vertically. Be aware of the context of the event and the writing. So we're thinking that context once again. So when they write certain things, obviously what Jesus does, but also when John writes his gospel, there's a lot of Roman influence going on. And so think of those contexts and some of the things that they actually do right. So you're thinking horizontally, you're thinking vertically. And here's one more thing I want to make sure you understand. Be careful with parables. Be very careful with parables. Does anybody know what a parable is? So stories that Jesus told, right? It's like a story with a kind of point. Like, the sower goes out and he sows seed. Or here comes a story about something. And the reason why they're so dangerous is, if you read it in Mark, it says that one day the disciples came up to Jesus and said, hey, Jesus, you keep telling all these stories and parables, and they're hard to understand. So why do you talk in this kind of stuff? He says, well, I talk this way so they don't understand. Oh, okay. So what do you mean? He goes, I've told these parables in a story form so people's spiritual minds like yourself can figure it out. They go, oh, good. And they look around, and then somebody finally goes, well, what if we don't understand it? And what does he do? He explains it. And so it's telling a lesson, it's telling a story. What you got to be really careful with is that we don't make Jesus say things he did not say, right? So don't allegorize parables. This is huge. Don't allegorize parables. And that's a fun word, but so you know what an allegory is. It's a story where every single detail means something else. In fact, your next line here is this. An allegory is a story that is interpreted to have a secret meaning. So a lot of times people will look at Jesus and say, well, he's telling the story, and it sounds like he means this, but probably there's a secret meaning, and I'm so spiritually minded and gifted, I can figure this out. And so they develop this secret meaning behind the story, and in reality, sometimes it's very dangerous. I have one in there, Augustine interpreted the Good Samaritan as an allegory and missed the plain teaching of the text in Luke 10:29. Let's turn to Luke chapter 10 really quick so we can see this played out. Luke chapter 10. All right, if you look at verse 25, this is called the parable of the what? Good Samaritan. Okay? When it says, verse 25, and behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit life, eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? So this guy sets up the question, and Jesus is about to respond, and he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. So once again, what is Jesus about to tell us about this story? What is he trying to get across? Who is what? Your neighbor, right? Okay, so this sounds like Sesame Street, but this is Who is your neighbor? Well, when you look at that passage, you obviously see this guy who's beaten up and he's taken alongside the road. And what Augustine, he came up with a secret meaning. If you look on your notes there that I gave you, it says this is how he interpreted the story. The man who went down was actually supposed to be Adam, and he went to Jerusalem, which is the heavenly city of peace. Jericho was the moon. The thieves were the devil and his demons. They stripped him of his immortality. They beat him by persuading him of sin. It goes on, if you go to the next page there. The Samaritan means guardian, which represents Christ. All these different things. In fact, if you go all the way down, the innkeeper is supposed to be who? Paul. Well, maybe that is a interpretation of that story, or maybe Jesus was trying to say, who is your what? Neighbor. He says, I'm telling you a story about who your neighbor's supposed to be. Don't try to get too spiritually minded that you just miss the plain meaning of the text. And that's what's happening here, is that this guy said, okay, no, the story's got to have some kind of secret, deeper meaning. Listen, if Jesus wants people as simple-minded as me to understand his scripture, he can't make it too complex, okay? And so sometimes he just says, this is what I'm going to teach you. Don't complicate the matters. Digest the parables by identifying points of reference to which the original hearers would have connected. So when you look at these parables, you're identifying points of reference to which the original hearers would have connected. What's beautiful about this is you think through Judaism, you think through certain things. Jesus had such a way of teaching. He was very much an object lesson kind of person. He'd say, hey, y'all see that tree over there? It's about to die? That's right. Let me tell you a story about it. And guess what happened? Every time they passed by that tree, what were they thinking about? That story that Jesus taught. It was a way to communicate in a very illiterate society. It was very oral in nature, where you would share things and communicate through stories. Jesus was an absolute master at it. Now, discover to whom the parable is addressed. That helps you out a lot as well. Discover to whom the parable is addressed. If you're still in Luke 10, I want you to turn over to Luke 15 really quick. When you look at Luke 15, verse 11, this is the parable of the who? Prodigal son, okay? When you look up all the way up at verse 1, look at the context. Luke is going to provide for us. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable. So he's sort of setting up. Here are these religious people. How dare you associate with sinners? He's going to tell the story. What do you think it's geared towards? Religious people who think they're too good for these other people, right? So you look for these contexts these writers give you and provide for you, and it's very, very helpful. Now, why are 4 Gospels necessary? They're not there just to be repetitive or to make you go crazy like which one goes which. There's a beautiful, beautiful reason, and here's why. Different Christian communities needed a specific book about Jesus. Different Christian communities needed a specific book about Jesus. So, I'm about to show you some stuff that hopefully will help you understand. But Matthew wrote to a certain group of people that Mark didn't write to. So they're different. They're different how they word things. They're different in what things they include and what they exclude. They're very specific based on the audience and who they're speaking to. Now, as individual accounts, they each tell a complete story to a particular people. Once again, Luke's gospel is complete. John's is, Matthew and Mark are complete. But it's very specific. It's tailored to a particular people. Some of you guys know this. If you especially for the guys in the room, and you to tell your mom something you're doing in the backyard, you can tell your dad a certain story and tell your mom a different story. You follow me, right? Guys, you understand this? You can tell dad, hey, we were swinging by this tree. It's really dangerous. So I'm like high-fiving. You tell your mom, it's like everything was safe, mom, right? It's a little different depending upon who you're speaking to at that time. These men are speaking to different people who are very different. As a whole, they fill in details and provide more perspective of one period from different perspectives. So as an individual, they give you a complete picture. But when you put all 4 of them together, they provide this even more beautiful landscape as what you look at and how you see what is put forth before you and it's just wonderful. So you read them separate, they're good. But you read all 4 of them together, and it just even opens up so many other things, and you start seeing how beautiful they were composed and put together. Now, when I put on there what makes each gospel unique, this is, I'm telling you, I know that I don't have a lot of gas in the tank, and just been praying that for whatever reason, we got done with second service today. It was just like it was gone, just out of nowhere. And normally around this time of year with some allergy stuff, I normally lose it at one point, but I know I was a little weak during the service today. When we got to the end of it, I just had nothing left. So this is more than I had about an hour ago, so I thank the Lord for it. But this is one of my favorite things to teach. Some of you guys are going to be glad that I got no voice, because I would spend 5 hours doing this because I love this. So you're like, thank the Lord. Okay, but I absolutely love this, because when somebody taught me this years ago, it helped me understand so many things. And so this is going to somewhat seem at first like, okay, well, what's the big deal? But if you start getting these pieces of information together, what's going to happen a little bit? I'm going to be able to read a Bible verse, and you're not going to know which gospel it came from, and you're going to be able to figure it out. Now, you can't do this with every verse. There are going to be certain things that I'm going to show you, but I hope they're going to start bringing in some context things. So let's look at these 4 gospel authors and really pay attention to these details. First off, the intention of the guy by the name of Matthew is he presents Jesus as Israel's Messiah. That is the goal. That's the intention. He presents Jesus as Israel's Messiah. And so, with that being, his primary audience is who? Jews. Do you understand why now this would be the first gospel in the New Testament? Why would that be? Because it is right connected to the Old Testament. So he put Matthew there first. I don't believe Matthew was first written. I believe that he was the second, maybe the third written. I believe Mark was the first. But I think they put Matthew at first because he's the logical connection between the Old Testament. In fact, I want you to turn to the book of Matthew really quick. Go to chapter 1, we find. Chapter 1, and what does Matthew start with? The book of the genealogy. Wow, there's a way to get people to read your book, right? Start your book with a genealogy. That makes complete sense. He says, Jesus Christ, the son of David and the son of... So he's pointing you back to Israel's greatest king in some ways. He's pointing you back to the father of the Jewish faith and telling you this Jesus came from both of that lineage. He's going to come down. He's going to start Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, go on, David, Solomon, all the way down to, and I love the way it's said, look in verse 16. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. So Matthew starts with a genealogy showing he is Jewish pedigree, and he is very, got good lineage. Now, notice this. What do you notice about verse 23 in chapter 1 in your Bible, how it is written? What do you notice about it? Some of you have it written, it's like an indented, right? Some of you have all caps. You see that? If you look in your footnote, I want to teach you this. If you look, what do you see about that footnote? There might be a note there pointing you to something else. What is it telling you? It comes from somewhere, right? Where? Isaiah 7:14. You see that? So what Isaiah is doing to a Jewish people is, hey, you remember reading Isaiah 7:14? Jesus is the fulfillment. And it's showing you, and there, this is a quote from the Old Testament that Matthew is trying to get all the Jewish people to wake up and say, see it fulfilled. Turn over to chapter 2, verse 6. What do you notice? See the indent, see the all caps, see the quotation? Look at chapter 2, verse 18. See it again? 3, 4. You see a little pattern here? If you go through the book of Matthew, guess what you see? A ton of, pointing back to the Old Testament. Look, he is the Jewish Messiah. The one we've been waiting for is right here. He is the one we've been talking about. So he sets this up. Also, the author source of this book, he was a first-hand witness as one of the 12 disciples. So Matthew was one of the original 12 disciples, which is kind of special kind of an incredible thing to be able to say that you have that right too. So he's one of the first-hand witnesses as one of the 12. So he had a good perspective of the life of Jesus. If somebody could go and do that for me, then come up here. Do the whole lesson that way. I need help. Gotta love technology. What was his occupation? He was a tax collector. Matthew was a Jewish tax collector that was collecting taxes for who? Romans. Okay. So we're in Jewish land, and yet you're a Jewish man, and you're collecting money from me because the Romans have invaded. You think Matthew was a popular guy among the Jews? Not a chance. Not a chance. And yet Jesus said, oh yeah, come be on my team. This is going to be awesome. Okay. The date, most likely the 50s to the 60s. Does anybody know around the year where we believe that Jesus was crucified? 33 to 37 is where most people would say, somewhere around there. I believe that Jesus lived, that he died on his, around when he was 33. He started ministry when he was 30. We know he died when he was around 33 because we see him celebrate 3 Passovers in the Gospels. So there's 3 anniversaries coming around. So most likely he died when he was 33, but based on the dates, either around 33 to 37. So you go, well, why did they just get around to writing the book 13 years later or so? You ever thought of that? It's kind of weird. Tell me what do you think Matthew's life looked like from the 30s to the 50s? Hiding, running, sharing the gospel, people trying to kill him. You don't have a whole lot of time to write a book, do you? There's not. And they were also expecting Jesus was going to come back very soon. That's what they thought. And so there was this kind of like deal of, they were sort of getting things situated in the church, the movement's happening, and now they're saying, hey, legends are starting to get out there about Jesus, and some of it is not exactly what was true. We need to write down as first-hand witness so that all this legend and myth is sort of taken away and we get down to actually what happened. Now, here's this perspective. I want you to look, here's some specific verses that tell us about who this person was. Turn to chapter 9 real quick. Chapter 9, verse 9. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. That doesn't sound like even a discussion. It's just like, hey, follow me. Come on. And he does. Now look, and as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. The Pharisees are going to see this. They're upset. But Matthew is saying, this was me. I'm a tax collector, not loved by my people. I'm associated with sinners, and yet Jesus came looking for me and brought me in. And so he has a unique perspective. Now, and also in chapter 10, if you just look, he is listed in there in the 12 disciples. One thing that you notice, if you see down there, once again, if you look at verse 3, it says Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collectors. That's kind of what he was known as. So there's a picture of Matthew. Now let's look at Mark for a second. Mark, his intention was he emphasizes that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So where Matthew is looking at a Jewish Messiah, Mark looks more at he is the Christ, he is the Son of the living God. He wrote to the Roman Empire. That was his primary audience. When you think back in those days, we know about the early church and the Roman Colosseum. What do we know about the Roman culture back then? Just when I say the word Colosseum, what do you think of? Death, right? Fighting, gladiators, people wrestling bears, right? You know what I'm talking about? This is what you see in the Roman Empire. So do you think that Mark probably said, hey, let me give you a 10-page sermon one time Jesus gave? Do you think he said that? No. You know why? Because the Romans were, it's like a UFC cage fight all the time. That's what the Romans were. So what does Mark really tell? He tells a story of, guess what Jesus did? And then they immediately followed him. And then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And he's very, very quick oriented, very action oriented, very disciple, come follow me oriented. Not, there is teaching material, but you're not going to find the Sermon on the Mount in Mark because it's too long for the Romans to digest. You're going to lose their interest. So he gets into, look what Jesus did, and then he told a parable about it, then he did this, then he did this, then he did this. The author's source, he's a disciple of Jesus. He's not one of the 12, though, and he got most of his information from Peter. So Mark was considered, or John Mark, as you'll see sometimes in Paul's letters and different things. John Mark was a disciple of Jesus. He's a part of the 500 that were associated with Jesus during his days, but he wasn't part of the 12. So he's kind of on the outskirts, seeing a lot of what's happening, but he wasn't chosen as one of the 12. And most likely, he got most of his first-hand information from none other than Peter, because Mark did a lot of traveling with Peter, did a lot of things with him, and so there's a lot of the information that's collected there that he got directly from the guy that sort of takes the lead after Jesus ascends in heaven. His occupation, we don't know. He's just a drifter. We don't know what he did. And really, I believe he's kind of young, and he starts traveling with these guys and sort of serving as just an evangelist, but as far as a trade, we don't know anything about that he did. The date, most likely, 50s to the 60s. Most likely 50s to the 60s. I'll tell you, if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what you're going to notice a few things about is that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sometimes the passage almost looks exactly the same. Worded the same way. And you think, well, how in the world do these three guys write the same thing? My belief is that Mark wrote his gospel first. It's the shortest out of those three, okay? And so when Matthew writes his gospel, he looks at what Mark has. I'll give you an example. Who was at the transfiguration with Jesus? 3 disciples. They were Peter, James, and John. Okay? So did Matthew have an encounter like that? Was he there at the transfiguration? Nope. But Peter was. So one day Peter and John Mark are traveling. He goes, you'll believe what happened one day. It's like Jesus kind of transfigured in front of us. Oh, wow. That sounds awesome. Explain that to me. And he's writing this stuff down. Well, then Matthew gets a copy of that, and he sort of writes some of those things down. And what happens, though, is as Mark writes this certain thing, and Mark writes a lot of things throughout his gospel, what you also see is that Matthew expands on some things. He's going to say, let me fill in a little bit more of the story. Luke's going to fill in a little bit more of it, but I think Mark is kind of the basis for what they did, especially because Peter saw a lot of it. The author's perspective, here's some verses for us to look at on who these gospel writers are. So look at Mark chapter 14 for a moment. Mark chapter 14. All right. Back in these days, when people write literature like this, it's a little bit different because sometimes they would give you clues as to who they were without outright telling you their name. So never at the beginning of Mark do you see, hey, my name is Mark, and I'm going to tell you a story about Jesus. Sometimes you see that. But Mark is like what John is going to do and other authors of the day where they're going to leave context clues that's going to seem very random, like out of nowhere. Why are you even saying this? And it's going to be a clue to who their identity is. Look at Mark 14. Mark 14. And it says, if you look at verse 43, what you know is the betrayal and arrest of Jesus. There's a betrayal and arrest of Jesus. Look at verse 50. And they all left him and fled. Here are all the disciples leaving. And then look at this random couple verses. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. And they led Jesus to the high priest. Now, does that not seem random to anybody? Like, why in the world? Jesus is being arrested, and now he's at the high priest. Why do you include a story about some kid who's running around streaking in this area because they try to grab him as one of these disciples, and he just takes off and runs around naked? Why was that? Because John Mark going, hey, y'all remember that night when that guy ran around naked? That was me. In this type of literature, people would always just throw a clue in like this. So most likely, in the randomness of the story, John Mark is, yeah, y'all remember that guy running through the field that night? That's the guy that was writing the story. See, I was there, I was on the outskirts, I was watching this, and I was coming through, but I want you to know this is what was going on. And so, once again, there is this aspect of it that he is indicating who he is. But also I want you to notice this. Look at verse 66. When you see this account of Peter denying Jesus, I want you to notice something. When it looks down to verse 71, but he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know this man of whom you speak. So what Mark is saying is, in that moment, Peter is cursing, he is swearing, he is yelling. Okay, so that's coming here in Mark, who's getting most of his information from who again? Peter. When John writes this in this cross-reference, you know what it says about it? It says, and Peter denied Jesus, and then he heard the rooster crow and he walked away. Well, John, why aren't you being rough on him? Because I believe in this moment, John's kind of being nice to his brother Peter, and Peter is telling Mark, oh, no, don't sugarcoat this. I was awful that night. Awful. And he just gives him the pure story. And so what you find a lot of times is a lot of this information on Peter is not very nice in Mark. And I think there's something very interesting about what's happening in the character of Mark during that time. Let's look at Luke really quick. Luke. All right, this one is written to a Gentile man named Theophilus as a presentation of a careful investigation of all the facts about Christ. I want you to turn to the Gospel of Luke really quick when you write that down, because this was a little bit more intense. Okay, but written to a Gentile man named Theophilus as a presentation of a careful investigation of all the facts about Christ. Now, I told you when Matthew started his Gospel, it starts out like this. Here's a genealogy. When Mark starts his Gospel, he basically says, and guess what happened one day? John the Baptist comes out preaching, and then Jesus does this. When Luke begins to write his gospel, it's very, very different. Very, very different. So I want you to look to Luke chapter 1, and I want you to do something for me. I want you to look at these 4 verses together, and I want you just to read them right now. If you just read them to yourself, and I want you to take some notes about the type of person who writes this. What do you think? Okay, so read Luke 1 through 4. What do you notice about Luke? Does he use big words? I mean, listen to this. Once again, Matthew says, here's a genealogy. Mark says, and John the Baptist comes out preaching, and then he does this. And Luke says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account of you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. What? Does anybody else feel that? Like, that was the longest sentence you've ever read? Like, what? Who is this guy? He's the type, you know what I'm talking about? When you go to the doctor's office, and you say, what's wrong with me? And they give you this long description, and you go, so do I need medicine? Like, give me the simple answer. Luke is a very smart person, and he gives you these long examples, long explanations that go so big. And here's what you also notice. If you open up the Greek New Testament, which some of you guys are reading through right now, I can read John, okay. I can read Mark, okay. I can read Matthew somewhat. Luke, oh my goodness, that grammar man. He's just out there. He's brilliant. Completely different animal. And so he also, you see this, he is writing to a friend named Theophilus. We'll call him Theo for short. Theo, you won't believe what I've worked so hard to find out. I have studied, and I believe Jesus is the Christ. I want you to know about this. So he's very careful investigating the facts. here's what we also know. His primary audience is that he's speaking to Gentiles. He's speaking to Gentiles. Matthew spoke to who? Jews. And in a Jewish context, there were Jews and Gentiles, which meant everybody else. You mean that Jewish people thought it was them and everybody else? Yes. Gentiles, the word in Greek is ethnos, which means what? Ethnic. Ethnic people. There's us and everybody else. Everybody else. So what happens is that Matthew writes this account and Mark writes this account, and it's very oriented to certain people, and Luke goes, there needs to be a gospel written to everybody else. The people aren't going to necessarily go to the Old Testament. They're just like, now I want to know who is he. So he writes to the Gentiles. The author's source, he's a colleague of Paul, and he interviewed many sources. Luke has seen a lot of Paul's writings as he writes to the people, and we believe that he interviewed many sources as he went through the area. Obviously, was Paul around for all of Jesus' activities? No, but was Paul aware of them? Very well. And Jesus would meet with Paul even after his resurrection. So there was obviously a connection there. But Luke interviews a lot of sources. His occupation is what? He's a doctor. He's a doctor, so obviously he done had some school, okay? He done been to school, people. He knows how to write. He knows how to think, detail things. He really goes back and forth on understanding some stuff. And also the date is most likely the early 60s. Pretty confident that he wrote after Matthew and Mark. Most likely it was Mark, Matthew, and then Luke wrote. Early 60s. Author's perspective, we've already looked at those verses there, Luke 1 through 4. But I want you to look at chapter 2, verse 19 for a second. This is when the shepherds, the angels are coming to Mary, and the shepherds come in and they see Mary. And then in verse 19 it says, I want you, guys, listen to this. I want you to ask, has any guy ever said anything like this? But Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. Does that sound like a dude thing to say? Or does that sound like more like a mother saying that? Yeah, it does, doesn't it? So, here's a belief. Most people believe that Luke interviewed Mary later in her life. He went out and sought out the mother of Christ and said, I want to know. So guess where you find most of the birth narrative? In Luke. And so once again, when you have a doctor who's very deep in his words, and he goes, and Mary just treasured these things, pondering them in her heart. This is what I envision happening. Luke's got his pen and his paper. He's interviewing Mary. She's later in life. And all of a sudden she goes, and then you won't believe what happened. These shepherds came in and they said this. And you know what, Dr. Luke? It was just like I was just sitting there and I was just treasuring those things and pondering them in my heart. And he's like, oh, that's good. He's writing it down. He's just writing it down. And so you see a lot of details in Luke that you don't see in other places. Now let's look at John. His intention was he attempts to persuade theologically for people to believe in Jesus. He attempts to persuade theologically for people to believe in Jesus. John makes no hesitation about it. I've written this so you'll get converted. I want you saved. This is more than a historical account. I want you to believe this, and I want you to be changed by the gospel. He attempts to persuade them to believe in Jesus. So his primary audience then is non-Christians. He calls for a response. That's why John's a very, very good gospel to walk with somebody who's not a believer. Hey, let's read this together. Let's see what he says. Because throughout it, John's going, I've written this so you'll know. I've written this so you'll believe. I've written this so you'll know that you believe. Primary audience, non-Christians. His source, he is a first-hand witness as one of the 12 and even the inner three. When I say the inner three, some of you may know what that is, some of you may not. Sometimes there was only room enough in the car for 3 people to go with Jesus. Okay? There are 12 disciples. Sometimes there's a special trip and only 3 guys are going on. And it was always Peter, James, and John. So You think Jesus ever got criticized for playing favorites? Probably. But yet, John is one of these three. In fact, I believe through what John is going to say here, not only is he one of the three, I believe that he is Jesus' best friend. I think Peter was the leader that Jesus was pouring into, but when it starts talking about John, it is almost as if this is my best friend. This is the guy that I'm the closest with relationally. And so he's inner three. His occupation was a fisherman. So he was one of the fishermen that Jesus called out from the boat. So there are four fishermen. Peter and Andrew are brothers. James and John are brothers. They were sort of in business together. So he is a fisherman. So he is one of those guys that Jesus called and said, hey, why don't you leave that fishing business behind and come let's make fishers of men. The date is around AD what? 85. You notice that's pretty significant, isn't it? It's very different than those first three Gospels, all written within the 50s and the 60s, right? Now we're talking at least 25 years later. Why would he wait so long to write? I think, this is my belief, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they served a purpose, and then as John is getting later in his life, he's about to die, there are certain things that he wants people to know that weren't covered in this. So he doesn't address all the stuff that Matthew, Mark, and Luke does because, well, it's there. It's great. But I want you to know some of the conversations that Jesus had with just us. And I want you to know the time where we had a lot of crowds and he sent people away from us and it was some deep teaching. And I want to get you into some of those things. And so he says stuff that the other gospel writers don't even say. And I think that's why he addresses it years later. The author's perspective, there's a lot of verses there. But I want you to turn really quick to John 14. We'll just look at a few of these. And I wrote down the wrong verses there. Let's go to chapter 18 real quick. Sorry. Here's what I'll get at. Remember how Mark didn't tell you who he was, but he sort of gave a context clue? I'll give you another proof of people who used to do this. Look at chapter 18, verse 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Well, what was his name? There's only 11 others to choose from. Why don't you tell us his name? In some of those contexts, those Jewish people, the way they wrote, you don't include your name. It sounds prideful. So he just says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watching the door. So John is given a context clue to say this, I believe, that John really knew the high priest, either as a family friend, or some people believe that maybe the high priest, John was his favorite fisherman. He'd always go to him for the best fish. So he's got his connection. So all this is happening, and John knows he's got a relationship with the high priest, so he gets in and sees some of this that maybe he wouldn't have access to. If you look at chapter 19, verse 26. Jesus on the cross. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. Why don't you say the name? Because it's John. It's most likely John. Think about this. There's 7 recorded statements we know of Jesus on the cross, and one of them he's taking care of his mommy. That's beautiful to me. You got the whole weight of the world's sin on your shoulder, and you want to say, make sure mom's taken care of. Because most likely, Joseph is dead. And he really doesn't trust his other brothers to trust her to them as the oldest. Why? Because they don't even believe who he is anymore. So he's saying spiritually, John, I need you to take care of my mom while I'm gone. Woman, it's not like a derogatory, don't go home and call your mom woman. Okay, don't do that. But he's basically saying, this is now I want you to treat him as your son. And it goes on. From these verses, you see a lot of times where Jesus is going to say these things and say the disciple whom he loved. Once again, to show this type of affection, this was his best friend. Okay, now, here's the thing I love to do. All right, now that's going to put this a little proof to the test. Which is the most likely gospel? Understanding that each gospel author wrote to a specific audience mentioned above. Look at the following statements. Think of which gospel it's most likely found. Now, if we had time, I'd make you do this quiz on your own. You turn it in. I'm just kidding, okay? We already said this. It feels more like school anyway. But I want you to look at this. Which gospel author, I want you to think about this for a second. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all have healings in them. But what author might have provided more healings than the others? Does anyone want to take a guess? I'm hearing Luke. Why Luke? It blew his mind as a doctor. Blew his mind. You mean he did what to your sickness? He includes a huge amount of healings. Because I think as a doctor, it blew his mind what Jesus could do. So Matthew, Mark, and John have lots of healings. But Luke is the guy who has a huge number of healings. A lot of that in there that nobody else does. All right. More parables on money. You guys got it. Why? You want us to do what with money? Are you kidding me? Okay. So for those of you who go, wow, a lot of those financial principles and practices a lot of times happen throughout the book of Matthew. Once again, you might find them in other accounts, but it happens a lot in Matthew. Next, less amount of teaching material. Okay, it's Mark. And here's why again. Remember, he's writing to who? Romans. You got to keep it moving. Got to keep it moving. Don't spend too much time. Now, there is teaching stuff, but it's always around action. Okay? Prefers to say kingdom of heaven rather than kingdom of God. This was hard. You have to think for a second. All right? Somebody said, who would be talking to the Jews? It's Matthew. Okay? Now you go, what does this mean? Matthew is speaking to who again? Jewish people. And Jewish people are very much so, don't take the Lord's name in vain. So a lot of times Jesus would say the kingdom of God is at hand or the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And I think Matthew would choose to write kingdom of heaven because some of the Jews would say, oh, I'm not listening to this guy. He's using God's name all the time. Well, he wasn't using it in vain. Jesus never used anything in vain. But I think what he did was, I think Jesus probably said both. When Matthew wrote it, I'm not going to make it a stumbling point where these people won't listen to me anymore. I'm going to put in kingdom of heaven versus the kingdom of God. Follow me? So the same verse in Matthew, Mark looks different by one word. One word. Next, starts Jesus' family tree with Adam. Okay, it's not Matthew. All right, somebody said it Luke. Why? Because he wrote to the Gentiles. Why would that be important? Because Matthew writes, so we want to make sure you know he's Jewish, but Luke wants to say what to Gentiles? We're all part of one family. We all came from Adam. So we're going to start there. Adam had a son, who had a son, who had a son, who had a son, who had a son, and now here's Jesus. Basically saying to a Gentile audience, we are all a part. Yeah, they're Jews and they're Gentiles, but ultimately we all come back from one person, and you Gentiles are worthy to hear this gospel. We want you to hear it. Roughest on Peter's character. Mark it is. And isn't that beautiful? Where John is nice, but the same story. Sometimes Matthew or Luke or John will say, one of the disciples, the unnamed disciple, stuck his foot in the mouth, and Mark goes, oh, it was Peter. That's him. What about? Why? Because I think Peter's heart had changed so much. And we go, let me tell you my story. Let me tell you how much I messed up. And so if you really want to see Peter in a bad light, you read it from Mark, and he got his information from Peter. And that's beautiful because I think here's this humility in Peter's life that happens later in his life that Christ will work on him. The I am statements. John, the great I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, the life. I am the resurrection of life. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. All come from John. 7 of them. Why? Because these are these deep theological statements. These other guys didn't include. And he's like, how did y'all miss these? This is important. Why didn't y'all write these down? I'm going to write them down in my gospel. So he includes them. Makes a lot of theological statements through them. Starts Jesus' family tree with Abraham. Matthew, right? Because he wants to show this is a Jewish Messiah. All right, we're almost there. Most descriptive of the virgin birth. Okay? Luke, for 2 reasons, I think. One, as a doctor, no way. Right? And also, he's the investigator. He's the one who found Mary. Hey, talk to me. Tell me what this has happened. So when it's that time of year and it's Christmas and you're going to read the Christmas nativity to your family, guess where you don't go? Don't go to Mark. Don't go to John. You go to either Matthew or Luke, because that's what's leading. And it's interesting. Matthew really shows Joseph's sides of things from a Hebrew lineage, right? And Luke describes really Mary's perspective of it, and because I believe that he interviewed her personally. So if you were watching Linus tell the Christmas story on the Peanuts Holiday Extravaganza or whatever, you're hearing, that's always Luke. It's always Luke from Mary's perspective. You're hearing a lot of that. Plenty of fishing stories. John, absolutely. So obviously other gospels will include it. But there's also this belief that, all right, so the story where Jesus is catching fish and cooking fish for his disciples after his resurrection, guess who's going to include that? John is. So he's fascinated with a lot of these fishing stories, so John includes a lot of those in there. Most Old Testament quotations, you got it, Matthew. He's going to say, look, he is the Jewish Messiah. Let's keep looking back throughout this. Very detailed and retelling facts. Luke, right? He's very investigative. Let me tell you exactly what happened. There's a lot of details he'll include that other guys don't. So for those of you analytical type, you love Luke. You love him. He uses the word immediately 41 times. Mark. So some of y'all think that I'm fast-winded and you're really excited tonight because I have to go slower, right? Okay, I get it. You would be exhausted with Mark because he's like, oh, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this. It's just over and over and over and over. As I was just like teaser for you a second, but as I was really praying through next year for sermons and whatnot, really wanting to look at, do we study one gospel together? Just really as a whole, study a whole gospel. And while I love so many things about other ones, I thought, I love the fact of Mark because it is very much like Jesus did this and you follow him now. You come, you make disciples now. Don't delay, come follow him, do this. And so the other day when I'd spent some time just really praying through it, I read through the book of Mark about 3 times, just back to back to back. And it was just beautiful just to see like just Jesus on display, just going and doing all this wonderful stuff. And but he literally used the word immediately 41 times. Okay, now I want you to read the verse here and see if you can tell which gospel this would come from. And behold, your relative Elizabeth in her old age has also conceived a son. And this is the 6th month with her who was called barren. Does anyone want to take a guess? Right, you're right on, Luke. It's a birth story. It's about Mary's cousin. There's this personal aspect to it. There's like details that only the family should know. This is Luke. He is going investigative. He's figured it out. Next. All right, really pay attention here. So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbered about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. Say, Mark, you're right. It's entertaining. Some of the other gospel writers will talk about that Jesus threw like demons into pigs, but Mark wants to go, and they went to the sea and drowned there. Isn't that cool? We're like, wow, that sounds awesome. It's just very, very action-oriented. And so he includes some of these details. Some of the other guys go, I don't know why that's that important. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Who's that? Does that sound theological? Just John. Deep, it's theological. It's very thorough in content, like it sounds like some kind of person trying to teach you theology. And then, only gospel all through that says this. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. That is who? Matthew. You guys are awesome. So you see some of this stuff. I just gave you 4 verses, and you knew exactly where it came from. Exactly where it came from. Just based on some of these things here. And so, to end this, the better you understand the context of each author, the fuller you will understand the passage and identify where it belongs. Hopefully this will give you some tools and maybe even determine the next gospel you want to read based on how you're kind of bent, right? And how you go through it. So let's praise the Lord and pray to him and thank the Lord that we made it through this. And I am sorry y'all had to endure through raspy travel. Hopefully I'll be back soon, okay?